Welcome to another Urban Farmer episode. Now in this episode I'll show you how to cure meat. Now this is only how I do it, so this is basically going to be my version of it. It's not necessarily the best way of doing it or the worst way of doing it. It's really just how I do it. And this is going to be the very first part, because this is going to be a multi-part series. The reason being because there's a number of different steps in curing meat. This is going to be a 3 to 4 part series, and there's 3 to 4 different parts to this process. This video will be part 1, and that is obtaining the meat itself and what type of meat to obtain, and as well as the very first process of ensuring that the meat doesn't go off, and the first part of that is rubbing the meat in salt and essentially allowing the salt to soak into the meat for about 5 days. What meat do you want to get? You can virtually cure any type of meat, but the meat that I like to cure is pork belly. And the reason for that is that you can put it in a lot of stews and so forth, and that allows that sort of nice smoky flavour to come from the stew. The other part that I like to cure is pork loin. So it's a long piece of meat. Essentially, the reason why I like to cure that is because it's nice when it's cut up. You can put it into a sandwich. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. So the first step in this whole process is to try and take as much of the skin off of the pork loin. Okay, so what we're going to do, or what we need to do with this meat, now this is from the back of the pig, and we want to take these white bits away. And the reason we want to take those away is because when we rub this in salt, these white pieces don't allow the salt to go through to the meat as well as it should. So what ends up happening, and on this other side you'll see that there's no white bits there, and the salt sort of seeps in underneath, but it doesn't from the top, and that's what we want to prevent. So essentially what the meat ends up looking like is that, and you want to have as sharp a knife as you possibly can to achieve this. I mean, it's a very slow and gradual process, but essentially that's what you need to do. The other part is, depending on pork belly that you buy, some pork belly may have ribs on it. Now, what I do is I remove those ribs. The ribs can be dried on their own, and they can be also used in cooking and all that sort of stuff. And I just have the ribs on their own and the pork belly on its own. And that just sort of, it's very beautiful in cooking. You can even eat it straight off when it's nice and cured and dry. Okay, so what I'm doing now is, see the ribs here, I'm separating the ribs from the meat and the fat itself. So this is basically pork belly, and it's still got ribs on it. So these are the ribs. We're going to take the ribs off, and we're going to dry the ribs separately. And the meat itself, we're going to put it into this box here, put salt on top of it, and let it sit there for 5 days until the next step arrives. But essentially what we're doing with the pork belly, essentially we are going to take the ribs off. So what we rub this meat with, so the second part of this, once you've got your meat and you've cut the bits off that you don't need, so the second part of this is to actually go and salt it up and just like rub it with salt as much as you want. So the next step is putting it into salt. And you rub every part of the meat into the salt, just like that, and you ensure that the salt is well absorbed. So the other thing that we use is paprika with salt, and the reason we do that twofold: one, it gives it a little bit of flavour, and two, it gives it a bit of colour. There is, but there isn't. You can't really go wrong with the amount of salt that you put in. Obviously, the more salt that you put in, the more salty it'll be down the track when you dry it and so forth. But some of these things you really have to sort of do it once and then sort of refine your recipe down the track. We put just enough salt so we can rub it onto the meat. There's two reasons for that. One is flavour, and the more salt you put, the more salty it'll be, and obviously you're not going to eat as much of it because it's very salty, but it's very beautiful at the same time. And the other part is that it actually prevents the meat from going off. So this meat is going to be rubbed with salt. It's going to be placed in a tub for 5 days, enough time for that salt to sort of, one, kill any bacteria that's there, but two, that also just to really sort of absorb into the meat. And once we take it out of the tubs, we're putting it essentially in fresh air. So you've got to make sure that when you've rubbed that salt in, you've rubbed it really well so the meat doesn't go off. Then what ends up happening is we place all the meat into a tub as such. Back when I used to do this with my dad, we would just have bigger tubs and we cover them up and we leave them outside, and that's predominantly because it was cold during that time. Although Grandma definitely likes to have smaller tubs and put it into the fridge, which I actually agree with. So if you're going to do this at home, have smaller tubs and fill them up how much of meat you want, and ensure that it stays in the fridge. It stays in the fridge for about 5 days, and during those 5 days, every day or two, what you want to do is you want to rotate the meat around. You'll notice after some time the salt draws all the water out, and you'll notice quite a bit of water in this tub. So what happens is the water that's underneath there, so we're going to have another tub where we're going to re-package this meat from one tub to the next for during the next 5 days. We're going to have the topmost piece of meat into a new tub, and we're going to just stack them as they are. And then the water that's in this tub is going to be poured into the other tub, or the new tub. I'll show you that process when we do it. We basically just make sure that you don't have too much heaping out of the tub. Meat needs to be about level height as the tub most of the time. So the next step is when you've rubbed all of that salt and paprika onto the meat, you put it in containers. Now, you can put in a container, you can put in plastic bags, you can put in whatever you want. Essentially, that meat needs to be in some sort. It needs to be closed. 2 reasons why it needs to be closed. One is so it doesn't dry out, and 2, that it keeps that moisture, and also meat will take out. So that salt will draw out a lot of the water from the meat, and you'll notice those tubs having a lot of water, and you don't want that water evaporating or anything along those lines. So especially if you're keeping it outside and not in the fridge, you want to make sure that you've got some sort of a lid, or it's tied up in some form, in some form or another, basically. Next steps. There's a couple of things that we need to think about for the future. Every day we need to rotate that meat. When 5 days expires, we're going to be taking that out, and then we're going to light a small fire in a shed that will basically produce more smoke than fire itself, and then it'll just sort of then we'll hang that meat, and the smoke will just do its thing and preserve the outside of the meat and give it that smoky flavor. Then once we've done that for a couple of days, we'll go and hang that meat somewhere where there's a lot of airflow, and we want a lot of airflow to make sure that it breezes past the meat and then really sort of cures and dries that meat. Once we've done that part, then what we'll do is we'll package it up, and the way that we'll package it up, we'll cut it in pieces that we want to consume. And then once we've cut that into the pieces that we want to consume, we put into little sealable bags. We place those bags into the freezer, and then that can then last for up to 2 to 3 years. Though we only make enough to maybe last us a year at most. Most of the time, it actually gets eaten way before that. So if you're hearing some noise in the background, it's my son pretty much destroying the kitchen. So that's pretty much the process. So once we've packaged it up, we put in the freezer. We never put in the fridge. The only things that we put in the fridge is the things that we want to actually consume within the next week or something like that. But everything else goes into the freezer. Another pro tip that I think is I usually cut things up straight from the freezer. I never defrost it and then cut it up. It's a lot easier to cut, especially if you've got the slicer that slices meats, and it's just a lot easier and nicer to consume when it's basically just take it out. And when it's frozen and you leave it out, once you've cut it up, you leave it outside for 2-3 minutes, and in all honesty, it just goes back to being its normal self. So that's pretty much what we do to ensure that that we have cured some meat for us. Now, just to give you an example of pricing, So just to give you an example of pricing, the cost of meat that we purchased is about $7 to $8 a kilo. The cost of cured meat is about $30 to $50 or $60 a kilo, sometimes $100 depending on what you're buying. So as soon as you cure it, and it doesn't require that much time, it's actually quite an interesting process to go through personally, I think, and it's something that you can pass on to from one generation to the next. I just think that it's a very simple way of saving money, being able to have meat at any point in time. You don't need to, whenever you feel hungry, you can just cut it up and it's just right there. So you don't need to go to shops to buy that sort of stuff, I feel anyway. So anyway, I hope you liked this particular episode. There's going to be a couple more I want to do, and so the other episodes that I'm going to do is I want to show you how we rotate the meat. I want to show you how we smoke the meat. So light the fire underneath the meat itself and how we hang it and all that sort of stuff. And then where we're going to put it for the air to essentially dry that meat. And then I also want to do a video on packaging, because I think packaging is quite important. You don't want to make pieces too big or too small, and you want to sort of have pieces big enough so that every time you go and consume it, you're basically taking out just the right amount. So that's it for today, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.